Today's talk is going to be on some latest research, particularly on resilience planning and urban heat, that type of thing, by Dr. Sara Meerow. Dr. Meerow is an assistant professor at Arizona State University. She's in the School of Geographic Sciences and Urban Planning. And her work is, I think, kind of the new forefront of what we want PhD, early career professionals, scholars like Sara, interdisciplinary social ecological systems scientist. That's how she cast herself. And she works on the intersection of urban geography and planning. And that is a lot of overlaps there, the interfaces, and she really takes a lot on. Her core focus, I think, is fascinating: how to make cities more resilient in the face of climate change and hazards, while at the same time more just. She does a lot of work in an environmental justice arena, and something that's absolutely critical in the climate resilience work. And she's published widely, even though she's only been out, I think, 5 years or so from her dissertation, published extensively in some of in the top journals. She's won a major prize, the Weddell Prize, if I'm pronouncing that right, early on in her just when she was graduating or near there, getting her PhD at University of Michigan. She wrote I think just an absolutely groundbreaking paper defining resilience in the landscape and urban planning, and has just gotten a lot of attention. She's published in other major journals in climate, landscape and urban planning, and Journal of the American Planning Association, just across. So what she's going to talk today about is some recent work she's been doing. I'm proud to have a small part of it, and I'll hand it to Sara now. And I think there'll be some time for question and answers as we get towards
Yes, I will do my absolute best to make sure I don't go too long. So yeah, thank you, Phil. You're too kind. And hello, everyone. I am sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. I was really hoping that I would, but I'm glad that I can still share some of this work, which, yeah, has really been a lot of what I've been focused on for the last year, well, really 2 years, I guess, that I've always been thinking about climate resilience, and heat has been part of that. But yeah, I've really kind of shifted focus to focus a lot of work specifically on extreme heat. And I'll kind of talk about why I think that's important, and why this has become something that I'm increasingly interested in. Of course, part of that is also that I am here in Phoenix, Arizona, right? Which is, as I'm sure many of you know, very hot. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So, okay, let me go ahead and share my screen here. So, I think I probably don't have to tell anyone that it's getting hotter, right? 2010, 2019 was the hottest decade on record. It probably will end up being the coolest decade of, the next century, right? Basically every decade seems to be getting hotter. 2020 was the hottest year, and we've seen, numerous record-breaking heat waves in recent years, many of which have had, really deadly consequences. And one of the reasons that we're seeing this rise in temperatures is, of course, climate change, right? So the Earth has already warmed over 1 degree Celsius, or almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And, that might not sound like a lot, but the key thing is that even a small shift in global average temperatures can actually translate into a really big change in the number of extreme heat days that we're experiencing. And that's what this sort of, this graphic is showing, right? So even just a small shift in average, we're looking at a lot more extreme heat. And in fact, the latest IPCC 6th assessment report included this other graphic, which I've shown here, showing that just 1.5 degrees warming, which, is definitely probably something that we're likely to hit, a heat event that would have previously occurred in once in 50 years is now likely to occur more than 8 times in 50 years. So we're looking at more heat because of climate change. And then, of course, we have urban areas, which are warming at a much faster rate than surrounding areas because of something called the urban heat island effect, which is essentially something called the urban heat island effect, which is essentially a phenomenon whereby urbanized areas are hotter than their surrounding or natural areas because of the built environment and waste heat. So this combination, right, of climate change and the urban heat island effect means that cities in particular are dealing with a lot more extreme heat than they used to. So just to give an example from where I am, right, from 1970 to 2018, temperatures in Phoenix increased an average of 2.4 degrees Celsius, or over 4 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So that's quite a bit more than, you know, the global average, more than twice as much, in fact. And this warming trend becomes very clear, for example, when you look at Phoenix's climate stripes, which are what you're seeing here, right? So we can see that it's just a lot hotter on it than it has traditionally been in recent years. And it's also really clear that heat exposure is not evenly distributed across cities. As Phil said, I care a lot and think quite a bit about environmental justice, and heat really is an environmental justice issue. Several recent studies, for example, one led by Vivek Shandas, as well as Bev Wilson, so planners as well, have shown that neighborhoods that were formerly redlined are actually hotter today due primarily to differences in the characteristics of the built environment, as well as vegetation patterns, right? Which are, again, linked to long legacies of discrimination and injustice. And, you know, why should we all be worried about this, right? Well, I think the bottom line is that heat kills, right? It's actually already the deadliest weather-related disaster, a statistic that, you know, any heat researchers will tell you, but I think a lot of people don't really know that, in fact, you know, heat kills thousands of people each year. And for example, where I am in Maricopa County, Arizona, they're quite good actually about tracking heat-related deaths. And what they've found is that they're really on the rise. So there were actually more than 300 heat-related deaths in 2020, which really shattered previous records. And in addition to heat-related deaths and illnesses, there are other impacts from heat, right? It affects your quality of life, economics, right? Potentially, if, you know, people don't want to visit, for example, places, you can't, you know, people can't work outdoors. There's water and energy use impacts. And the issue is that even communities that haven't traditionally worried about heat are really having to. You know, I think the clearest example of this is just look at what happened in the Pacific Northwest last summer, right? And we know that all of these heat impacts, again, aren't evenly distributed across the population. So I want to give an illustration here, again, from this Maricopa County heat death data. So if we look at 2020, we can see that actually Black and American Indian residents in Maricopa County perished at much higher rates. So 15% of those who died were African American, while they actually only account for 6% of the population here. And 4% of the deaths were American Indian, while they're actually only 2% of Maricopa County's population. We also see that more than half of those who died were experiencing homelessness, right? So again, clearly equity issues in terms of these heat impacts, and particularly the worst possible impact rate of death. So hopefully this, I think, gives you a good sense of why we should care about heat and what this extreme heat challenge is looking like, and why, you know, it's really should be something that communities everywhere are thinking about. So now I want to shift gears a little and talk about some of the work that I've been doing to try and think about how we can tackle this problem with planning, right? So to start off, my colleague at the University of Arizona, Lad Keith, and I have been doing a lot of this work, so you'll hear his name throughout this. We sort of set out to try and figure out how urban planners in communities across the US were thinking about extreme heat. So what we did was we conducted a survey. We did it on 2 samples to get a really wide range of planning professionals' perspectives, but the one I'll reference throughout this talk is a stratified random sample of planners from 69 cities of different sizes and different climate regions. So you can see the respondents mapped out here. And again, we just wanted to get pretty representative idea of like what is the current status of heat planning across the US. And what we found was that, when it comes to heat impacts, the big takeaway was that more than 80% of planners said that their communities had been impacted in some way by heat. So we're already feeling the effects. The top 5 most commonly reported impacts were energy and water use, urban vegetation, public health, and quality of life. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, given these impacts, right, the majority of planners said that they were either at least somewhat to very concerned about extreme heat impacts overall, and generally concerned about economic, environmental, and health impacts specifically. We also found that planners were more concerned about climate change as a contributor to extreme heat than the urban heat island, which actually is a little bit, it's kind of interesting given that the planners potentially have sort of more opportunity to address the urban heat island specifically in their community, right? As opposed to climate change, which is a global challenge. But that was just an interesting finding, I think. So in addition to this survey, we also dug into the academic literature on heat planning to basically kind of say, okay, well, what is the current status of research? And what we found in this systematic lit review is that the vast majority of studies have really focused, so these are all studies that include the terms heat planning, right? Or heat and planning. And the majority of these really actually focus on modeling, either urban heat islands or modeling vulnerability. There are some studies that focus on the relationship between specific kind of design features in the built environment and heat, but actually really very little work that focus on how we actually manage this hazard, right? So actually just 7% of the heat planning studies that we were looking at actually dug into planning or governance processes. And the few papers that did kind of concluded that the current efforts to deal with extreme heat are very fragmented, and that it tends to be sort of an invisible problem that kind of doesn't have an owner. No one's really responsible for it. So in light of these findings, I would argue, and as we actually did in a recent comment in the journal Nature, we need stronger heat governance now. And when I say heat governance, what I mean is we need actors, strategies, processes, and institutions that are going to guide decision-making for both equitably mitigating heat in cities, reducing heat, and managing heat impacts. And I'll talk a little bit later about what exactly I mean by that. So that's sort of the big picture, right? We need more heat governance. And this needs to happen at all levels of government and different scales. But what can, say, a particular city or a planner who wants to proactively prepare for extreme heat, what can they do? So Lad, Keith, and I actually have a new open access past report that's going to be published by the American Planning Association, hopefully next week. So coming out really soon and will be available to anyone thanks to a NOAA grant, which Phil has been a collaborator on. I'll talk a little bit about later. But in this past report, we really lay out a framework for urban heat resilience, which we had not really found anywhere before, felt like it was kind of missing, and which we've sort of tried to visualize with this sun graphic that you're seeing here. And so I'll spend the rest of my time today kind of walking you through the key principles in this framework. But of course, first, I think it's important to acknowledge, so I've done, as Phil sort of mentioned, I've done quite a bit of work on thinking about what resilience means. And I totally recognize that it can be a fraught term. So in this past report, we have adapted the definition that some other colleagues and I proposed several years ago for urban resilience. We've adapted that to heat. And really what's key about this is that it recognizes that resilience is not just about resisting change, right? Or bouncing back, say, from any kind of chronic or acute heat risk, but actually about bouncing forward or actively changing parts of the city that essentially aren't working well. And we also highlight in this graphic, right, that there are different contributors to urban heat that in combination with efforts to actually address heat, right, those mitigation and management strategies, is what's ultimately going to shape the heat impacts to different urban systems, right, to infrastructure, environment, social systems, as well as the economy of a community, right? We also include 7 principles in our framework for urban heat resilience planning. And we actually adapted these from the 7 principles of strong climate change planning that I published on or laid out in a 2020 perspective in JAPA, co-authored with one of your alumnus, Sierra Woodruff. So the first of these 7 principles is the importance of laying out clear goals for heat planning. So again, here we've adapted them specifically to heat planning. So importance of having goals, here we say for heat planning. And when it comes to heat planning, if you want to think about it holistically, you need to consider both heat mitigation and management. So mitigation is really about cooling the city, right? Primarily by reducing how much the built environment contributes to urban heat. And heat management is about preparing and responding to basically any of the extreme heat that you're not able to mitigate, right? And cities need goals and objectives for both, we argue. And they also then need corresponding metrics of success. So they need to figure out, what's their goal and how are they going to evaluate whether they've achieved that goal, right? So citywide metrics for mitigation could include things like reductions in land surface temperature, right? Which is fairly easy to track using satellite imagery. It could also include vegetation or like tree canopy goals. On the heat management side, cities might want to track and reduce, for example, heat-related deaths, right? Illnesses, emergency room visits. Again, different indicators, but those are the types of things we're thinking about. And of course, as we start discussing goals, right, it should be already clear that communities are going to need information, right, on current and future heat risks. And this is what we refer to in the second principle as having a strong fact base for urban heat, right? Now, when it comes to heat, a challenge is that there actually are a lot of different types and sources of information that are potentially relevant. And because, as I've sort of already alluded to, there are different factors that are contributing to overall heat risk, and these risks are changing rapidly, there's not necessarily going to be one particular indicator that you're going to want to use. You're probably going to need some combination of different data sources. And it can be actually helpful, we would argue, to combine these different data sources into maybe a single platform, like Pima County, which is the county where Tucson, Arizona is in. They've tried to do that. So as part of their resiliency planning tool, they brought together a number of different heat-related indicators, such as surface temperature, but also vulnerability data, locations of cooling centers, et cetera. So what information are planners using right now, right? Again, we want to understand sort of where we are and where we need to go. So in our survey, we actually asked what heat information planners were using. And good news was that we found that over 70% of the respondents said they were using some kind of heat information. That's what you're seeing in orange here. The most common sources were vegetation maps, a heat index, and historical temperature data. On the flip side, future scenarios for heat were actually reported as the least commonly used. And in addition to asking what they were using, we actually also asked planners whether they weren't using information because they didn't think it was useful or because it wasn't available to them. And our idea here was that latter one, the information that they just don't have access to, right? That's the sort of information gap that researchers and climate service providers could actually really usefully fill. And that's what we're showing here in red. And what we found was that planners said the biggest gaps, right, were in terms of those future scenarios, land surface temperatures, air temperatures, and heat vulnerability maps. And actually, we found some of that a little surprising. So particularly things like land surface temperatures, because some of that is actually already available for a lot of communities. For example, the Trust for Public Land has created heat severity maps for every city in the US based on Landsat, so satellite land surface temperature data. And these can, be really helpful in terms of showing where some of the relatively hotter neighborhoods are, or determining, how much hotter the city is than surrounding areas. So what kind of is the intensity of the urban heat island, and guiding policies aiming to reduce that, right? But, and here's where it starts to get complicated, it's important to note that land surface temperature is not the same as the heat that people actually experience in a place. So this probably shouldn't be the only information that communities are using for heat planning. So for example, if you are trying to plan specific heat mitigation strategies or management strategies to keep residents cool at a small scale, maybe at a site level or in a particular neighborhood, land surface temperatures actually have been shown to not be particularly helpful. And actually, even ambient air temperatures from, say, a nearby weather station still isn't that indicative of how people are going to feel, what their thermal comfort will be in a particular location. Wet bulb globe temperature is actually a lot closer to that. So that might be something we want to measure, because that takes into account humidity, solar radiation, wind, right? So it's going to be different if you're in the shade versus in the sun. But wet bulb globe temperature is costly, a lot more costly to measure. And it's also going to differ, again, depending on exactly where it's measured. So if you're looking for something where you have, temperature data across the whole city and how different neighborhoods compare with other ones, it's going to be difficult to get that information from a wet bulb globe temperature. It would involve a lot of work and time and cost to actually, get that data. And of course, this is all just for mitigation, right? And we said we need to combine mitigation and management. So what kind of information or fact-based do we need for management? Well, we need information essentially about who is at risk, right? And that's really the goal of things like heat vulnerability indices, such as this one, which is produced by the US NIHIS, which is an interagency effort to focus on heat. And the key point that I want to take away, or that I want you to take away from this, right, is not necessarily that any one of these is the solution in terms of information, but rather that different heat-related goals and different planning scales are going to require different sources of information, and there's sort of pros and cons to these. And so you do need to think carefully about, what information you're using to inform heat planning. Okay, so moving on to the third principle here. What do you do with all this information, right? There are different strategies for achieving heat mitigation and management goals, right, that communities can use. And as part of this past report and some of our work, Lad and I have really tried to actually categorize them. And while I'm not going to have time in this talk to go through all of them in depth, we do that in the past report and kind of review the literature and evidence for each of them. I do want to give you a little bit of a rough sense of what they look like. So on the heat mitigation side, we identify essentially 4 categories, right, of strategies, which we've tried to bring together and actually visualize in this graphic here. So they're land use planning, urban design, urban greening, and waste heat reduction. So as we sort of show in this graphic, right, with respect to land use, we see that open spaces have been conserved, right? Surface parking is going to be minimized. This is in an ideal community, right? A community that's really proactively mitigating heat. We'd have buildings that are oriented, right, to really maximize shade and increase ventilation. We also want buildings that are designed to maximize, or places that are designed to maximize shade, particularly for pedestrians. And also to enhance energy efficiency. So making sure that you don't have too much thermal radiation, right? Sunlight kind of coming in at the hottest times of the day. A variety of different shade structures are used, which shelter pedestrians, park users, and those waiting at transit stops. That's going to be important. We might use cool pavements on the road. We have different forms of vegetation, water features, right? And waste heat is also going to be reduced. And this is something I think people don't necessarily always think of, but trying to reduce waste heat through the promotion of walking and biking can actually also be a heat mitigation strategy. Now shifting to the heat management side, what are some of the strategies? Well, these are going to include policies and programs that really focus on energy, particularly ensuring that residents have access to reliable and affordable indoor cooling, right? Strategies geared towards reducing personal exposure to heat. So this includes, things like making sure that children aren't out, during the hottest times of day, or trying to inform people about heat risk. These also include public health and emergency preparedness strategies. So again, trying to sort of visualize what that would look like if you bring it all together in a community. Here we can see that we have a resilient electricity grid powered by different forms of renewable energies. We have solar panels, right? Wind energy. We have buildings that are air conditioned. We have shade structures, trees, umbrellas that are helping to, again, reduce personal heat exposure for pedestrians, for children on playgrounds. And there's public health interventions, right? Things like we see informational signage and water distribution. And there's also a resilience hub, right? Which essentially acts as a shelter, cooling center to whoever needs it during an extreme heat emergency. So I've tried to sort of lay out the ideal here, right? But which strategies are cities actually using? What's most commonly being implemented? So we did ask this in our survey, and what we found, again, promisingly, 90% of planners said that they had implemented one or more of these heat strategies. The majority said that they actually implemented urban forestry, urban emergency response strategies, weatherization programs, and man-made shade. So those were all reportedly used in the majority of our communities. So we do see, thinking about this, a mixture of both heat mitigation and management strategies. So that's, I think, positive. But we see that really very few communities have regulations or staff that are actually dedicated to heat. So again, we're sort of seeing a lack of these governance institutions. And a minority were actually conducting heat vulnerability assessments, which to us seemed like a gap. So clearly there is room to scale up efforts in communities. Moving on to the fourth principle, right? Because of how complex and varied urban climates and cities more broadly are, right? It's difficult to predict exactly how effective some of these different strategies will be. And also, so they're basically going to vary by community. Some of them are also quite, innovative and new, things like some of these cool pavements, right? Really more in the pilot stage in many communities. And therefore, we argue that, communities should really try and recognize where there are sources of uncertainty about their future climate, about how these strategies will perform, and try and select strategies that are going to be beneficial under a wide range of different futures, and, that hopefully have sort of multiple benefits. So in other words, this is what's sometimes known as, prioritizing no regret or low regret strategies. So just to, give a more concrete example, right? This is a green stormwater infrastructure installation on the campus here at ASU. So obviously it provides shade for students outside. This is right outside of the student union, provides nice shade. But on the rare occasions when it does rain here in the desert, as this picture that I took here shows, these installations also capture stormwater. And in this particular day, it was very clear that the areas around this green stormwater infrastructure were a lot less flooded than some of the other areas, which, were just paved over on campus. So kind of an example of one of these sort of win-win strategies. Great, right? So we can all agree that we should have heat goals. We need information and strategies, but who is actually going to do it, right? We've seen that there is not a lot of, dedicated heat staff in communities. And so this is really what's bringing us to the fifth principle, right? Which is the importance of coordination around heat action. So, we've already said no one really owns heat as it currently stands. Heat mitigation generally seems to be more in line with what urban planners and designers typically do. Heat management is more often going to be kind of the domain of public health departments, emergency managers. But at what level of government, right? What plan should be discussing heat in a community? Or, and should there be, say, a standalone heat plan? Should communities start developing those? Or, or should they be integrating heat strategies and considerations into all of their plans? So, let's take a look first at what's actually happening right now. So our survey confirmed that heat planning is currently quite fragmented. The majority of planners said that they were addressing heat in at least one of their plans, but no single plan type actually addressed heat in the majority of communities, according to our survey, right? So for example, sustainability, climate, and resilience plans were the most common place that planners said they were integrating heat. In the flip side, I guess, but that was only 36% of all planners. And then conversely, we see that the zoning codes and regulations are actually the least common. And again, this is potentially problematic because these are areas which, often have more sort of regulatory teeth. So this is a concern for implementation. It's also interesting, I think, to note that a minority of planners said that their communities were integrating heat into their hazard mitigation plans, which, seems like a fairly obvious place for it. And so something that, could be improved moving forward. So because cities really rarely have standalone heat plans, and we can clearly see from those survey results that heat strategies are being integrated into different types of plans and communities, right? We argue that we really need to think about a community's plans as an integrated network that's going to collectively shape heat risk and resilience. And in this thinking, definitely influenced a lot by the work that Phil and colleagues have already done. I'll talk more about that in a second. But yeah, so when it comes to heat, we argue you need to think about this network of plans, right? And just to give an example, right, of why this is, you could have a parks and recreation plan, right, that might call for new green space that would definitely help potentially to mitigate heat, right? So great. Then we might have a climate action plan, which also might mitigate heat through calling for new vegetated roofs and walls. But then we might have a transportation plan, right, which is adding new surface parking lots, calling for road expansions. And both of those things might actually exacerbate the urban heat island, right? And negate some of those benefits that we saw from those other plans. And so recognizing that this is potentially occurring and that this has been examined in the context of other hazards like flooding, with support from NOAA's Climate Program Office's Extreme Heat Risk Initiative, Lad Keith and I are currently working with Phil, as well as the American Planning Association and a team of really fantastic students to develop a step-by-step process that communities can actually use to identify potential contradictions in plans, like the ones I was just talking about, and to assess how various policies in community plans, such as new development, right, or new green space, how this would sort of collectively affect heat, and how these policies are actually distributed across the city, and how this interfaces with information on heat exposure or vulnerability. So this project that we're calling the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard for Heat, or PIRSH, builds on the original Plan Integration for Resilience scorecard that Phil and colleagues developed for flooding, I mean. And so how does this work? Well, basically what you do is first you identify all of the different plans that shape land use and the built environment. Then you look in those plans and find the spatially explicit policies, land use related policies. You categorize and score them based on whether they're going to increase or reduce heat risks. And then you actually add up those scores for each area across the city, right? And so for flooding, the analysis has typically been done just in areas which are flood prone, because heat, it's a little bit fuzzier. What is a heat hazard zone, right? We are actually looking at mapping these across the entire city. And the goal is to kind of get an overall sense of what the cumulative impact of this network of plans is on different neighborhoods and how it compares. And once you have this scorecard, right, you can actually compare scores with urban heat exposure or vulnerability maps to see whether plans are basically targeting the highest risk areas. So we're currently piloting this for 5 cities, and also planning to develop a guidebook that kind of builds on the one that was developed for flooding by Phil and his collaborators, so that communities can again actually apply this same approach more broadly. So it's meant to be a more generalizable approach. So to give you just a little bit more taste of what this is, so for every policy we categorize it based on the policy tool that it used, and we basically adapted the policy tools categories that were used for flooding specifically to heat, where you see the biggest changes in the types of capital improvements that we're looking at, right? And then we also are adding to that, we're also categorizing all of the policies based on which heat resilience strategy they fit with, using the framework that we developed that I sort of talked about earlier. And again, since this is a bit abstract, to give you some concrete examples of what this actually looks like, here are a couple of policies from Boston's comprehensive plan, where you can see actually how we categorize and score them. So for example, investing in active transportation corridor, including crosswalks and more walkable and bikeable green space along Columbia Road. So we can see it's clearly spatially explicit. It's talking about how it's going to increase sort of walkability, bikeability, and add green space. So we would give this we would score this as positive, right? That it's going to reduce heat risk or reduce vulnerability, enhance resilience, if you want to use a positive term. And you can see how we categorize that. Maybe on the other hand, we have preserving and enhancing industrial land, right? And in the context here, increasing job density, we think that this would actually potentially increase heat risk in this area. And then one thing we've also done is we also have identified policies that we think would impact heat, but it's not clear from how they're worded that whether they would be positive or negative. And what we want to do with this is we want to flag for communities just how often policies are likely to have an impact on heat, but that's not really being explicitly acknowledged, right, in the plan. And so the idea to sort of flag these for communities so that they can think a little bit more about how future development plans are going to have an impact on heat moving forward. And again, we're currently working, so we have identified all the policies, we scored them, and we're currently working on actually mapping the scorecards. And then the next step will be to compare those with heat exposure and vulnerability maps to kind of, again, see whether there's sort of spatial relationships between them. Okay, so that's a little bit about the project that we're collaborating with Phil on and thinking about this collaboration principle. The 6th principle then is inclusive participation in planning processes and fostering justice. So if communities are going to avoid contradictory policies, and if heat planning is really going to be successful, it's going to require coordination, right? And that's not just between different departments and different levels of government, but I would argue really genuine engagement with communities. And so what I've pictured here, this is, I think, one example of an interesting project. I was not directly involved with it, but I think it's quite impressive what their process for what they did. It was called the Nature's Cooling Systems Project here in Phoenix. And a number of researchers, nonprofits, they worked with several high heat risk communities in the Phoenix, particular neighborhoods that had been identified as high risk. And they worked with them over a number of different workshops over a long period of time to actually develop heat action plans, and did this, again, through a really participatory process. And I think this is something that, we'll probably need to see more of moving forward. So yeah, I just believe that, heat justice truly needs to be central to planning for urban heat resilience everywhere, right? Given how these sort of very clear inequities and the fact that heat really is an environmental justice issue. And so this means, not just making sure that heat risks and strategies are fairly distributed, right? Which again is important because we know currently they are not, but also recognizing that they have not been for a long time, right? There's been a lot of historical injustices, and therefore, because of this, we really need to customize strategies to meet different needs of communities. Communities should be part of this process, right, of developing, researching, and implementing these strategies. And we need to do this even if that engagement takes time. And I think that was kind of one of the lessons from that Nature's Cooling Systems project, was that, you need time to build trust. And, planners know this, right? As we do a lot of, public engagement work. So in short, I think, planning for heat equity, like planning for resilience more broadly, is going to require a distributional focus on equity, as well as a recognitional and procedural equity. So it's not just enough to have distributional equity, but also you need procedural and recognitional. And some of my research that has looked at resilience planning more broadly, not just focused on heat, what we found was that recognitional and procedural equity have received traditionally a lot less attention than distributional equity. And while of course that is, and even that is variable, right? So a lot of resilience plans, for instance, haven't really even made equity a focus. But even when they do, it tends to be this distributional as opposed to recognitional and procedural. And so I would argue that, as we move forward and as a growing number of communities start to engage in heat planning explicitly, we should try to avoid making these same mistakes and really, put equity and justice front and center. Okay, last but not least, given the urgency of the heat threat, right, I think we need to make sure that plans actually get implemented, because unfortunately we know that they often don't, right? And also because the science of urban heat really is evolving very rapidly, I think it would be very beneficial to monitor and evaluate how strategies work. And here I really see a great opportunity for researchers to partner with communities to actually do this monitoring. And I think a good example of this is a cool pavement project that's currently ongoing in Phoenix. So a number of my colleagues at ASU have been working with the city of Phoenix as they basically roll out a pilot program using cool pavement, and they've actually been monitoring it. And this project actually just won an award here locally. But yeah, I think we kind of need more of this, because I can definitely say, having tried to research all of these different heat strategies, the evidence base for some of them is kind of lacking, or it's only from certain locations. And I think there's definitely a lot more monitoring and understanding that is needed. Okay, so with that, I know I've gone through our heat framework fairly quickly here. I will say there's a lot more detail in the full PASS report, which I'm excited that you will all be able to read, right? Hopefully next week. And as well, there are a number of journal articles that I've listed here that I've talked about or mentioned throughout this talk. And I just want to end here by also acknowledging that, again, all of this work is very collaborative. I work in a very collaborative manner. And so, I couldn't do it without all of my great collaborators, including Phil here, and many others. So again, thank you very much. And now I am happy to take any questions. I think we've got a bit of time.
Any questions from the group?
Hi, I have a quick question. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your presentation. This is so incredibly interesting. I wanted to ask if you had any ideas. So I know we talked a lot about the urban heat realm. I'm working in areas in Eastern North Carolina that are inland and more rural, and was curious sort of what you see are differences when planning for rural communities and heat mitigation strategies for that.
Yeah, so, I think, most of my work has been very urban. I think that, a lot of this, obviously rural communities still deal with extreme heat, and, some of the strategies might still apply. I mean, in some cases, some of the mitigation efforts that are focused on reducing the urban heat island would probably not be as relevant. But certainly anything on the heat management side is going to be important, right? And I think one of the challenges is that often rural communities have a lot less capacity. I mean, when we're talking about heat governance, right, and sort of suggesting, oh, maybe communities should be hiring chief heat officers, right, or creating dedicated heat staff. I mean, in some rural communities, they don't even have a full-time planner, right? So the idea that they're going to actually have a dedicated heat plan or heat staff is just totally out of the realm of possibility. And so I think in those cases, making sure to just try to see if there's some coordination and just awareness about trying to, again, think about how development, how people are dealing with heat, to at least understand, to have some system of like heat warning systems out there. So yeah, in those cases, in my mind, the real focus might be more on the management side. So again, making sure people have access to cooling. I think cooling centers is going to be really important in terms of saving lives potentially if people don't necessarily have, if there's lower income and don't have, air conditioning, or it's too expensive to cool homes to a degree, if there's, too inefficient, then that can be really important. Thinking about energy kind of strategies, utility assistance programs, right? I think those are important in rural contexts. I know, thinking about, again, public health, making sure that there's some sort of emergency response plan in place for if you're going to have heat, making sure that you're getting information on, getting the message out to people and how you can do that in terms of, we've got a heat wave coming in, and like, where can you find resources, information, how can you, go to a shelter if needed. Those are all I think important strategies. And and another thing too is also, I think, in just making sure that, I think especially in rural areas, making sure that the energy grid is, that people aren't going to experience power outages, and if they do, that they have somewhere that they can go, like a cooling center, and that has some kind of backup, because I think especially in places where they might have there's risks of storms, right, things like this is like the big the worst case scenario is where you have a huge widespread power outage during an extreme heat event, and then people don't have access to air conditioning. People aren't even able to get information maybe out to messages. And so I think that's where making sure that you have a plan for how you're going to deal with that, and some way to reach vulnerable populations, know where they are. I mean, these are all the kind of key points. So yeah, I think thinking about that heat management part is probably top priority there.
Nisha Graves made a comment here about thanks for mentioning public health. I know Nisha and there's a whole group at the Institute of Public Health, Environment, that really focuses on that. And I don't know, Nisha, if you had a question, or was that mainly a comment? Or
mainly a comment. Thanks for mentioning it, Dr. Burke. Yes, our team, the Center for Public Engagement with Science, is working also in the Center for Environmental Health and Susceptibility. And one project we're implementing is to work with public health professionals who are going to use climate impact. We're calling it the Climate Impact Home Assessment Checklist, to kind of help residents that they're working with understand how climate events can impact the damage that's done to their housing and potentially to their health. We're working with a group now in Durham that's piloting the checklist and doing home assessments for asthma patients and their families. And so I'm very interested in hearing about the indications you made for public health and public health's role in this work and how important it can be. It's challenging when you think about planning versus the role that those public health professionals have in the here and now when they're walking into the home, and making sure they have the resources and information to share with residents. So I really appreciated this presentation and how you, there were aspects of it that I think could be really relevant to public health professionals who struggle to talk about climate change and share the importance of it with residents they're serving. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, I think as we were preparing this past report, right, I think one of the things that sort of we realized as we're doing it is like just how much of this like is, obviously planners have a role to play, certainly, but a lot of this work is much more, I think, traditionally been the realm of public health, departments and practitioners. And so I think the key moving forward is to try and get them to actually, work together, right, on this. And I think planners can, advocate and try and like promote these efforts. But yeah, they're going to have to work with public health departments and officials on these heat action, any kind of comprehensive heat action plan. So I think, yeah, you absolutely can't talk about this without talking about public health and, the role the really, really critical role that they're going to play there. So
Right.
yeah, I absolutely agree.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of people who are working on the ground and doing the home visits and working with residents and patients, emergency preparedness, I think they can more clearly see their role in emergency preparedness. And so, so I think there's room for further engagement and enhanced engagement with public health. But yeah, I completely agree with you in terms of their role. Thank you.
I might ask too, I think, I don't see any other comments or questions, but I'm loaded with them, but questions and what Nisha and you were just talking about, I think hits home with something I'm interested in. Oftentimes we sit in a domain, a particular, we're in health, or we're in transportation, or we're in parks, or we're planners in the city planning department or community. And so we try to promote something like heat and public health, and say the public health department is doing more than the other departments. And we've been finding, for example, in our own work, where you'll read the plans and there's lots of data, and particularly equity data that you can use for equity measures, for exposure and vulnerability and these types of things across population groups. And it'll be in one domain. And then the hazard mitigation plan, it's like there's no urban heat problem here and there's no equity problem here. And I can point to a couple of major cities, Charlotte, exactly that happens here in North Carolina, where there's just, they're not communicating. So one of the things I know you've written about in governance, Sarah, is like how climate is so, I mean, the heat problem is so new that there's not a lot of governance. There aren't laws and regulations and incentive programs, unlike maybe other types of climate-driven events that threaten communities. So do you have any ideas, any advice on this?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, I think there's different, I think right now we don't really know what the best model for heat governance is. I think it's very clear to me that we need more of it, right? And I think there's a couple innovation, there's a couple different models that could potentially work. One that is definitely one, innovation that's kind of happening right now, or experiment, is several cities have been appointing dedicated heat officers, right? So the first was Miami-Dade County, actually, and this was sort of appointed by a nonprofit or philanthropic organization. They also have one in Athens, in Sierra Leone, I think. I'm forgetting where the other one is offhand, sorry. And then Phoenix is actually the first city that created, through like its own city budget, a dedicated heat office and heat officer who is now, the first one is actually my colleague. So he's now has a partial appointment in our school, and then also appointment with the city. And he has a background actually in, heat, he has in part public health, but then is in the School of Geographical and Sciences and Urban Planning. So has, I think a pretty holistic picture on heat. So that's interesting. And then LA has also said that their city council has also supported the idea of having a heat officer position. So yeah, so a number of cities are basically creating these positions, and I think it's still an open question exactly how those work, right? Whether this is the solution in terms of heat governance, of having an actual person who's going to lead coordination and lead these efforts in a city. I think other models, right, that could potentially work is having a cross-department sort of committee that meets, working group on heat. But I think, yeah, and again, I think what would be really valuable is to actually evaluate those and how they work. We're kind of trying to do that with these new heat officer positions. I think if there are cities which have instead taken this cross-department or interagency sort of committee model, I would be interested, because I would also be interested to evaluate those and kind of compare how they work, and how this changes coordination, collaboration, and maybe concern and attention to heat over time. But again, yeah, it's just really starting. So I don't think we kind of know what the best model is. But I think it's definitely an interesting question for the future. And I think, I'm glad to see that something is happening across different cities, and see more action on this point. So I think, yeah, more is needed. I think it's a little bit to be determined what the exact best model, and it also there probably isn't necessarily one model that is going to be ideal for every community. A lot of it is, again, going to depend on resources. Like I was talking about, there's plenty of communities that are not going to have the finances, the resources to actually appoint a dedicated heat officer, but perhaps they could have more of a cross-departmental working group that at least gets the public health officials and the planners and the utilities to get together and kind of talk about heat.
Wonderful. I think we have room for another question if anybody has it. We're getting close to our time for ending. Okay, well, I think we're about 30 seconds to 1. So,
right on time. So
yeah, right on time. And this was excellent. I can't tell you how much I appreciate, and I think others too, your talk today. And Emily, will this be recorded?
Yeah, so we recorded,
great.
and I will make it available on our YouTube channel.
Right. Great.
And if you have colleagues that would like to have a copy, you can let us know. It'll be on our YouTube page, but
Okay.
if you need anything, just send us an email and we'll get it to you.
Okay,
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you very
so
much,
Dr. Meerow.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And hopefully next time I'll be there in person.
Okay, we would like that. It was really
Thank you.
very, very good. Okay, thank
All
you.
right, have a great day.
Okay, you all too.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.